Would you ever think that a Hollywood legend would enter the courtroom not as an actor, but as a real warrior in the fight for justice? This is not a science fiction movie. This is real life. And this is the story of Clint Eastwood, a man who has spent his life playing outlaws, lone gunmen, fearless warriors. But today, he is not standing on a movie set. Today, he stands before the Monterey County Courthouse, facing a powerful, cunning enemy who will stop at nothing to bring him down. In front of him, Richard Dawson, a real estate tycoon with an empire that stretches across California, sits there with an arrogant smile. He believes that money can buy the law. He believes that his power is unshakable. He believes that Clint Eastwood, a man in his 80s, is just an old man who doesn't know when to stop. But he misjudged Clint. When a legend is pushed to the limit, he doesn't back down. He fights. A small plot of land in Carmel by the Sea, which Clint has kept as a part of his soul, is suddenly targeted by Dawson. A luxury resort is being built without his consent. Warnings? Lawsuits? Dawson ignores them all. He's used to stepping on people with impunity. But Clint is not one to be bullied. This is not a battle of law alone. This is a battle of human will and the power of money. In front of dozens of reporters, under the constant flash of flashbulbs, Clint stands there calm but cold. He doesn't need to shout. He doesn't need to justify. He only needs one sentence to silence the entire courtroom. I don't need to be Dirty Harry to know right from wrong. And that's when the real nightmare begins for Richard Dawson. Evidence that has been buried for years is gradually uncovered. A witness suddenly appears, bringing with him the undeniable truth that Dawson cannot deny. Dirty tricks are exposed to the light. However, Dawson is not an easy person to defeat. He fights back. He plays dirty. He manipulates the media, creates fake stories, and makes Clint look like an old man trying to cling to the glory of the past. But Clint does not flinch, because justice is not for sale, because the truth cannot be distorted, because a real man never bows to evil. Can Clint Eastwood win justice for himself? Or will this be the first time that a Hollywood legend is overcome by power and money? Will this battle end in the courtroom, or are there other dangers waiting for him? This story is more than a lawsuit. It is a story of one man standing up for what is right. Don't forget to subscribe to Black Footprints today to follow the whole story. Because this is not just a Clint Eastwood story. It is a story of justice, perseverance, and truth that we all need to know. Legends are not always written in movies. Sometimes, they are written in the right things that a man chooses to do. The Monterey County courtroom was packed. Flashbulbs were flashing as reporters crowded into the front row, ready to capture every moment of the dramatic trial. But this was no ordinary criminal case or political scandal. Hollywood legend Clint Eastwood was not standing in court as an actor. Today, he was not Dirty Harry or the man with no name on screen. He was a citizen, a landowner who had been violated, and he had decided to take matters into his own hands. Sitting smugly at the defendant's table in front of him, Richard Dawson, the powerful CEO of Dawson Development, smirked. The man was no stranger to legal battles. He had faced off against many opponents before and always won. With a real estate empire that stretched across California, Dawson believed he could take on anyone. And with a formidable team of lawyers at his side, he had no reason to fear a man in his 80s. But Clint Eastwood was no pushover. The case revolved around a plot of land in Carmel by the Sea, a small seaside town that Clint loved as his own. He had owned it for years, a piece of pristine nature that he wanted to preserve. But Dawson, with his insatiable ambition, had blatantly built on his land without the consent of the rightful owner. Clint had sent warnings, complaints, and stop work orders, all of which Dawson had ignored. And now they were facing each other in court. Judge Wallace Bridger scanned the case file and looked at Clint over his reading glasses. A wry smile crossed his lips. "Mr. Eastwood," the judge said, his tone tinged with sarcasm, "I thought you were more interested in gunfights than courtroom arguments." A laugh went up from the crowd. James Whitmore, Dawson's senior counsel, crossed his legs, turned to Clint, and said sarcastically, "This is not Dirty Harry, Mr. Eastwood." The room erupted in laughter again. Reporters were quick to record the moment. To them, the case was nothing more than a slapstick comedy about a washed-up movie star trying to cling to the limelight. But Clint paid no attention to the sarcasm. He simply tilted his head, his cold blue eyes scanning his opponent. "I don't need to be Dirty Harry to know right from wrong," he said, his voice low but sharp. "We'll see who has the last laugh." The courtroom fell silent. Dawson, the smug man, suddenly felt uncomfortable. The real game had begun. A chill wind blew through the Monterey County courtroom as Clint Eastwood slowly rose. Without haste or fanfare, he opened his worn leather briefcase, pulled out a thick file, and placed it on the table with a deliberate thud. "I have something to present," Clint said, his cold gaze sweeping over Richard Dawson and his legal team. No one in the courtroom, not even Judge Bridger or Dawson's attorney James Whitmore, had taken Clint seriously before. A veteran actor defending himself? That was a joke. But when Clint began speaking, no one laughed. He had been preparing for this battle for 6 months. In that time, he had not only studied real estate law, but had also searched for every loophole in the system that Dawson had exploited. He lifted up a large, aerial photograph that magnified the undeniable truth. Dawson Development's massive building had been sitting on his land. "This was 3 months ago," Clint said calmly, flipping to the next one. "This was a month ago, and this was last week." Dawson continued to build despite my warnings. He scanned the crowd, stopping at Dawson, who was no longer smirking. But the show wasn't over. Clint placed a thick stack of papers on the table. Every email he had sent to Dawson and his legal team. These emails, Clint tapped the stack, have been sent over the past 4 months, demanding that Dawson immediately cease all construction on my land. Instead of responding, he ignored them all. Judge Bridger squinted at the document. A heavy atmosphere filled the courtroom. Before, they might have dismissed it as a farce, but now no one dared to take it lightly. James Whitmore, who had been mocking Clint, crossed his legs and shook his head sarcastically. "Mr. Eastwood, I understand that you are passionate about this case, but you are not a lawyer. Sometimes there are legal aspects that outsiders cannot fully understand." A soft chuckle came from Dawson's lawyer, but Clint was unfazed. He lifted his eyes and looked directly at Whitmore. A faint smile played on his lips. Then he said, his voice low but forceful, "I don't need a law degree to recognize when someone is stealing my land." The courtroom was silent. Not a laugh, not a word of protest. Dawson gripped the arms of his chair. Whitmore, for the first time since the trial began, did not know how to respond. And Clint did not stop. "Mr. Whitmore, you said this was a misunderstanding, right?" He picked up another stack of documents, thicker than the last one. "So, explain, why has Dawson been sued for similar behavior at least 5 times before?" He held up the old file, every single lawsuit against Dawson Development for trespassing on private land. The previous lawsuits might have been settled behind closed doors, but this time, Clint had brought it to light. A murmur ran through the room. Reporters were taking notes, some even pulling out their phones to report live. Dawson was on the verge of losing his way. Clint Eastwood, whom they had once considered a stubborn old actor, was officially in control of this trial. That evening, Clint Eastwood walked out of the courthouse, unhurried, unexcited. The legal battle was long, but he knew he had struck a blow against Dawson and his men. Yet even a seasoned warrior like him could not have imagined that his enemies would soon turn to dirtier tricks. His classic Cadillac sat quietly in the dark parking lot. When Clint opened the door, a small piece of paper fell onto the driver's seat. The paper was pale yellow, neatly folded, and signed, unmarked. He picked it up, unfolding it under the dim streetlights. "Depart or suffer the consequences." Clint stared at the words, his face expressionless. A warning, a threat. But if Dawson thought a cheap piece of paper would make Clint tremble, he had misjudged the man. A near accident. The next morning, as Clint got into his car to drive to his favorite coffee shop in Carmel by the Sea, a strange feeling welled up inside him. He had driven all his life, from his days as a young drifter to his days as a Hollywood legend, and he knew this Cadillac better than anyone. But today, something felt wrong. The brake pedal was too soft. Instinct told him to check. Clint got out of the car and knelt beneath it, his eyes immediately falling on a small pipe, almost completely severed. Brake fluid dripped onto the concrete. Someone had tried to kill him. The police arrived quickly, but there was no trace of the incident. No security cameras recording anything suspicious. No fingerprints. No witnesses. Dawson could deny any involvement, but Clint knew this was no accident. Dirty proposal. A few hours later, James Whitmore personally came to see Clint in a small restaurant by the sea. No longer sarcastic or joking, he sat down in front of Clint, placed a glass of wine in front of him, and lowered his voice. "Mr. Eastwood, we are both adults. There is no need to turn this into a war." Clint said nothing, just sipped his coffee, waiting. Whitmore slid a file toward him. $10 million. Just sign here, and the lawsuit will be over immediately. You don't have to go to court anymore. No one will touch you anymore. You could go back to enjoying your life. Clint put down his coffee cup. He looked at Whitmore, then slowly pushed the file back. "Justice is not for sale." Whitmore shrugged, sighed, but there was a flash of anger in his eyes. "I think you know when to stop. Be careful, Mr. Eastwood. Dawson plays dirty." In just a few days, the media began to change its tune on the lawsuit. The tabloids were filled with articles mocking Clint. The stubborn old man doesn't understand the law. Is Clint Eastwood using the lawsuit to promote his new movie? Some reporters who had once been on his side began to question his judgment. Is this really a land invasion, or just a stunt by a washed-up star? Dawson had used his money and power to manipulate public opinion. But Clint was not a man to be defeated by cheap tricks. He had fought all his life, on screen, on set, and now in the courtroom. If Dawson thought he could make it back down, he was sorely mistaken. The battle was not over. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense. Dawson had manipulated public opinion in his favor, and the press had slandered Clint, but today he had an ace up his sleeve. Clint stood up and stepped to the front of the stand, his voice booming, deep and slow like a loaded gun. "Your Honor, I would like to call a new witness, Mr. Daniel O'Malley." A murmur ran through the room as the back door opened. Daniel O'Malley, former construction manager for Dawson Development, entered with a determined look on his face. Dawson paled. Whitmore immediately jumped to his feet. "Objection. This witness was not on the original list." Judge Bridger raised his hand, signaling for Whitmore to sit. He turned to Clint, his eyes sharp. "Mr. Eastwood, what does this witness have to do with the case?" Clint nodded, turned to the jury, and looked directly at O'Malley. Daniel O'Malley was a construction manager for Dawson Development. He saw everything, and today, he's here to tell the truth. The truth is revealed. O'Malley cleared his throat, then began slowly. "When I was working for Dawson Development, I discovered 2 sets of blueprints for the Carmel project." The courtroom was silent. Everyone held their breath in anticipation. One was legal, submitted to the government for building permits. But there was another, the illegal one. In it, Mr. Eastwood's property line was intentionally pushed into the project. Whitmore jumped to his feet again. "Objection. There is no evidence to support this testimony." Clint interrupted. He walked to the witness stand, pulled a small USB drive from his pocket, and held it up in front of everyone. "There's evidence." Daniel backed everything up before he left the company. Judge Bridger motioned for the court clerk to take the USB, then nodded to O'Malley. "Go ahead." O'Malley took a deep breath. The second draft not only changed the boundaries, but it also had Richard Dawson's signature on it. A gasp rang out in the room. All eyes turned to Dawson. "I know this is wrong, but I also know that if I speak up, I'll lose my job." And that's right. When I objected, I was fired immediately. Dawson stiffened, sweat beginning to form on his forehead. Whitmore whispered something in his ear, but he didn't respond. Dawson was cornered. "I want this evidence filed in the case," Clint said, his eyes never leaving Dawson. Whitmore immediately jumped to his feet again. "Objection. This evidence was obtained outside the legal process. It is inadmissible." Judge Bridger banged his gavel. "Objection overruled. I will consider this evidence." A small smile crossed Clint's lips. Dawson and his attorney were both visibly tense. He was used to bribing, manipulating, using power to silence people. But this time, he couldn't stop the truth from coming to light. And Clint knew he had just delivered a decisive blow to his enemy. Whitmore knew this battle was getting out of hand. Clint Eastwood was not the hopeless old fool he had initially thought. He had not only prepared well, but he had also figured out how to exploit Dawson's every weakness to turn the tide. But Whitmore was not ready to give up. He stood up, straightened his collar, and walked toward the witness stand, where Daniel O'Malley was still sitting. With a sharp smile, he began his counterattack. "Mr. O'Malley, tell me the truth. Who paid you to stand here today?" The courtroom erupted. Clint leaned back in his chair, watching. He had expected Whitmore to make this move. O'Malley frowned. "Nobody paid me. I'm here to tell the truth." Whitmore nodded, feigning thoughtfulness. "Interesting. A man who was fired from Dawson Development just so happens to have the documents to come back and take down his former boss. It seems someone has provided you with a great deal of motivation." O'Malley clenched his fists. "I need no motivation other than my conscience." Whitmore sneered. "Conscience? Or a nice payday from Mr. Eastwood?" Clint remained seated. He knew when to let his opponent finish. And when Whitmore thought he had the game under control, Clint slowly rose to his feet. He walked toward the witness stand, then looked directly at Whitmore. "Mr. Whitmore, I have a question for you." Whitmore raised his eyebrows. "I'm not a witness, Mr. Eastwood." Clint smiled slightly. "Oh, but I think you can answer it." He turned to the jury. 5 years ago, a lawsuit in San Jose exposed another real estate project that used forged documents. And the most important witness in that case was... He paused, his eyes on O'Malley. "Daniel O'Malley." Whitmore paused. Clint continued, his voice low and firm. "In that case, O'Malley also came forward to accuse the developer. And what happened? He told the truth. He helped expose a fraud scheme." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Clint turned to Whitmore, looking him straight in the eye. "A man like Dawson may have money to pay for silence, but he can't hide the truth." Whitmore opened his mouth to retort, but the words failed him. Judge Bridger leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. Before, he had thought the case was a joke, but now his face was pensive. Something about it was making him question everything. Clint changed the balance of the battle. The courtroom was silent as Richard Dawson took the stand. He had never thought he would face Clint Eastwood himself. He was used to being behind the scenes, pulling strings, manipulating public opinion and the law to his liking. But this time, things were no longer under his control. Clint Eastwood stood slowly, without haste, without fanfare. He stepped closer to the witness stand, his piercing blue eyes fixed on Dawson like a gunman ready to fire. "Mr. Dawson," Clint began, his voice low and calm. "You received my warning letters, correct?" Dawson swallowed. He glanced at Whitmore, who was sitting at the defense table, but this time no help came. He took a breath, trying to keep his composure. "I may have received some letters," he said, his voice strained. Clint nodded slowly. "Then why are you continuing to build?" Dawson shifted in his chair. "We believe the project is within the legal boundaries." "You do?" Clint raised an eyebrow. "Or did you know you were building illegally and still did it?" Dawson gritted his teeth for the first time in the trial, actually feeling the danger. The fatal blow. Clint didn't wait for an answer. He looked at the court officer and nodded slightly. Suddenly, a recording filled the courtroom. Richard Dawson's voice, clear, strong, full of arrogance. "Just build it. If Eastwood wants to sue, he'll be exhausted before he wins." The courtroom erupted. Murmurs rose like waves. Reporters quickly flipped through their notebooks. Some even turned on their phones to record the moment. Dawson paled. Whitmore stiffened. Judge Bridger banged his gavel. "Order." But he couldn't hide the shock in his eyes. Clint turned to face Dawson. "What do you say to that, Mr. Dawson?" Dawson collapsed. Dawson jumped to his feet, his face red with anger and panic. "You're all assholes. This is a trap. A dirty trick." He waved his hand, but no one was listening. The jury just stared at him in silence, no longer seeing a powerful CEO, but a greedy man out of control. Whitmore sank into his chair, burying his face in his hands. He knew the fight was over. Clint just stood there, his blue eyes sharp and calm, like someone who had known this outcome all along. He had won. 6 hours. No one in the Monterey County courtroom expected the jury to take that long to reach a verdict. But 6 hours of tense waiting marked the event as one of the most dramatic trials of the year. Outside the courthouse, a crowd of reporters and locals gathered in groups, all glued to their phones or listening to updates from those inside. On social media, the case had become a hot topic, with thousands of comments fiercely debating it. Inside the courtroom, Richard Dawson sat motionless, his eyes dark. The man who had once confidently laughed at Clint Eastwood was now a shadow of his former self. He clenched his fists in his chair, his face twitching as if he were trying to contain a surge of panic. Sitting next to him, attorney James Whitmore looked no better. His always tidily combed hair looked messier than usual. His tie was a little askew, and his eyes were less confident than they had been on the first day of the trial. He knew that this battle was coming to an end, and perhaps not the end he wanted. The door opened. The jury returned to the courtroom. The atmosphere in the room suddenly became heavier than ever. All eyes were on the jury, who had just spent 6 hours deliberating. The jury foreman, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes, rose, clutching a piece of paper in her hand. Judge Wallace Bridger slowly adjusted his glasses, nodding at her. "The jury has returned a verdict?" The woman nodded. She cleared her throat, scanning the courtroom before speaking. "The jury returns a unanimous verdict. Plaintiff, Mr. Clint Eastwood, in complete victory." The room erupted. There were murmurs and applause everywhere. Some in the crowd even jumped to their feet, too excited to keep quiet. Reporters were taking notes. Some even turned on their phones to record this historic moment. On the other side of the courtroom, Richard Dawson looked like he had been punched in the face. He blinked repeatedly, as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. His throat tightened, and for a moment, he turned to Whitmore, waiting for some excuse or some solution. But Whitmore just bowed his head, saying nothing. He knew the battle was over. But Dawson's nightmare wasn't over yet. Dawson receives punishment. Judge Bridger cleared his throat, signaling the crowd to quiet down. The gavel struck the table as a firm confirmation of Dawson's fate. In addition to the defendant's return of all legal title to Mr. Eastwood, the court hereby orders the following. The room fell silent. Richard Dawson is hereby ordered to pay all financial damages for his illegal construction. In addition, because the defendant willfully violated the laws of the land and abused his power to distort the legal boundaries, the court hereby orders an additional special penalty against Dawson Development. A chorus of bewildered murmurs filled the courtroom. But no one was more bewildered than Dawson himself. He sprang from his chair, his eyes wide with despair. "Your Honor, please reconsider. My company." Bridger banged the gavel. "The request for a stay of execution is denied. The judgment is effective immediately." Dawson collapsed into his chair, his face as white as a sheet of paper. He knew what this meant. Immediately, a series of Dawson Development shareholders began to withdraw their capital. Within hours of the verdict being announced, the company's stock plummeted. The financial press ran a hot headline. Dawson Development faces bankruptcy. Richard Dawson's real estate empire collapses after just one trial. Investors turned their backs, and Dawson, who had once been arrogant in the business world, was now just a name trampled on the newspaper. Clint Eastwood, hero not just on the screen. While Dawson was immersed in his own disaster, Clint Eastwood just quietly stood up from his chair, lifted his cowboy hat, and nodded to Judge Bridger. He didn't need to say much. Justice had spoken for itself. Outside the courthouse, a swarm of reporters jostled to interview Clint, but he simply smiled, raised his hand in greeting, and walked away. He didn't need the media buzz to prove anything. But even though Clint didn't need it, the media exploded with a series of articles praising him. The New York Times headlined, "Hollywood legend is more than just an actor. He's a true defender of justice." LA Times, "Clint Eastwood, from the silver screen to the courtroom, an immortal symbol of justice." On social media, the hashtag #EastwoodJustice quickly became a national trend. Thousands of people shared his story, calling it a lesson in perseverance and justice. But Clint didn't care about fame or praise. A few days after the verdict, he returned to Carmel by the Sea, stood on a familiar beach, quietly watching the waves crash on the shore. In that moment, he was not Dirty Harry, not the man with no name, not a Hollywood legend. He was just a man who did the right thing. And that was enough. Carmel by the Sea was still the same. a small seaside town with cobblestone streets and old-fashioned houses where time seemed to slow down. But for Clint Eastwood, today the town held a special meaning. He walked slowly down the road that led to his land. The land he had fought to protect, not for money, not for fame, but for what was right. The sea breeze blew gently through his silver hair. The salty scent of the ocean filled the air. Everything was peaceful, just the way he had always wanted it to be. Ahead, a man stood waiting, Judge Wallace Bridger. Gone was the skeptical look or the ironic smile from the first day in court. Today, Bridger's eyes were filled with respect. He walked up to Clint, nodded, and said slowly, "Mr. Eastwood, I have to admit, I didn't think you would win at first. But you proved me wrong." Clint just chuckled. There was no smugness, no triumph. Bridger continued, his voice tinged with curiosity. "So, what are you going to do with this land?" Clint turned, looking around. The sky was clear, the trees casting long shadows across the land. The land was still, wild, untouched. No concrete structures, no flashy hotels to mar the natural beauty of the place. He took a deep breath and replied, his voice as calm as the sea breeze. "Keep it as it is." Bridger nodded. There was nothing more to say. He understood. Last image. Clint stood there, alone, in front of the ocean. The waves lapped gently against the shore. The wind continued to blow, whipping his silver hair, making it sway in the sunset. There was no applause, no cheering crowd. There was no need for it, because this is not a movie. This is real life. And a man who fought not for money, not for fame, but for real justice. As the sun set, Clint stood tall against the vast ocean, an eternal symbol of perseverance, integrity, and justice. Legends are not always written in blockbuster movies. Sometimes they are written in the right things a man chooses to do.